"Dad, there are two people at our door asking if they can sleep in our garage tonight." Marcus wiped the grease from his hands on his work shirt. Looking up from the broken dishwasher he'd been trying to fix for the third time this month. The ancient Kenmore had been Sarah's pride and joy, one of the few appliances they'd managed to buy new during their brief period of financial stability. Now it sat like a monument to better times, its chrome dulled and its motor wheezing like an old man climbing stairs. His 8-year-old son, Danny, stood in the doorway of their cramped kitchen, his wide eyes reflecting both curiosity and concern, still wearing his Superman pajamas that were getting too small but remained his favorites. The autumn rain hammered against their trailer's thin walls with increasing intensity, and Marcus could hear it growing stronger by the minute, turning the dirt roads of Cedar Falls Trailer Park into muddy rivers. He glanced at the clock on the microwave. 9:47 p.m. It was far too late for anyone to be wandering around their rundown neighborhood alone, especially with the storm that had been brewing all evening. Something wasn't right about this situation, but Marcus had never been one to turn away people in need, a trait that had gotten him into trouble more times than he could count, but had also defined who he was as a man. His own struggles over the past 2 years since Sarah's death had taught him that sometimes a stranger's kindness was the only thing standing. Between desperation and disaster, the thin line that separated hope from complete surrender. Marcus followed Danny through their narrow hallway, past the family photos that chronicled happier times, birthdays, Christmas mornings, Danny's first day of school with Sarah beaming beside him. The hallway seemed to shrink every day, the walls pressing closer, as bills piled higher and hope grew thinner. He expected to find some local kids whose parents had kicked them out for the night, a sadly common occurrence in Cedar Falls Trailer Park, where broken families were as common as broken dreams and second chances felt like luxury items nobody could afford. The Hendersons, 2 trailers down, had thrown their 16-year-old out just last week, and Mrs. Martinez regularly found strange teenagers sleeping in her carport after particularly bad nights at home. Instead, when Marcus opened his weather-beaten door with its peeling paint and loose hinges, he found himself staring at 2 young women who looked completely out of place in his world, like elegant swans who had somehow wandered into a junkyard. The twins appeared to be in their early 20s, probably around 24, with perfectly styled blonde hair that somehow remained neat despite the downpour that was turning everything else into a soggy mess. They wore matching navy blue coats that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month, maybe 2 months if his recent string of car repairs was any indication. The fabric looked expensive, the kind that repelled water instead of absorbing it, and the cut was tailored with precision that spoke of skilled hands and hefty price tags. Their eyes were an unusual shade of green, almost luminescent in the dim porch light that flickered intermittently due to the old wiring Marcus couldn't afford to fix. The color seemed to shift and dance, like emeralds caught in candlelight, and there was an intelligence in their gaze that felt ancient despite their youthful faces. They stood with a composure that seemed far beyond their years, perfectly straight postures that spoke of etiquette lessons and deportment classes, the kind of breeding that money could buy, but poverty could never fake. The young woman on the left stepped forward first, extending a small, manicured hand with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting exactly what she wanted, when she wanted it. Her movements were fluid, graceful, like a dancer who had trained since childhood to make every gesture appear effortless. "Good evening, sir. I'm Sophia, and this is my brother Sebastian. We were wondering if we might impose upon your hospitality for the night." Her voice carried the refined accent of expensive private schools and cultured upbringing, each word precisely enunciated in a way that made Marcus suddenly aware of his own rough edges and calloused hands. Marcus blinked hard, wondering if exhaustion was making him hallucinate, if the stress of working double shifts at the garage while trying to be both mother and father to Danny had finally pushed him over the edge into some kind of breakdown. These young people spoke like they'd stepped out of a Jane Austen novel, not like any 20-somethings he'd ever encountered in his blue-collar neighborhood where conversation tended toward the practical and profanity flowed as freely as cheap beer. Sebastian remained silent, but offered a polite nod, his green eyes scanning Marcus's face as if evaluating his character with the thoroughness of someone who had learned early to judge people quickly and accurately. There was something almost predatory in his assessment, not threatening but intensely focused, like a hawk studying potential, prey or a chess master, analyzing an opponent's opening moves, the way they carried themselves, their pristine appearance despite the weather, and their formal speech patterns all screamed money, the kind of generational wealth Marcus had only seen in magazines or movies, old money that whispered instead of shouting. Yet here they were, standing on his rickety porch steps that creaked ominously, under even Danny's slight weight, in the middle of a thunderstorm that was turning their trailer back into a temporary lake, asking to sleep in his garage like common vagrants. He noticed they carried no bags, no belongings of any kind, which struck him as profoundly odd for people who claimed to need shelter for the night. Even the homeless folks who sometimes passed through the park carried something, a backpack, a plastic bag, some token of their existence and travels. These two appeared to have materialized out of the storm itself, complete and self-contained, like beings from another world who had no need for earthly possessions. Despite his confusion and the warning bells ringing in his head, Marcus felt an inexplicable pull to help them, as if some invisible force was guiding this strange encounter, orchestrating it for reasons he couldn't begin to understand. "Miss, sir, where are your parents?" Marcus asked, straightening up as he tried to keep the rain from soaking through his already worn-out shirt that had seen better days before. Danny was even born. The question felt awkward on his tongue. These were clearly adults, yet something about their demeanor suggested they were still under someone's care and protection. Sophia exchanged a meaningful glance with Sebastian, one of those wordless communications that twins were famous for, before answering with careful precision. "They're indisposed at the moment. We found ourselves in need of temporary accommodation, and your home appeared to be the most welcoming in the area." Her vocabulary was sophisticated, each word chosen with the care of someone who had been taught that language was a tool of power and precision. Yet there was something vulnerable lurking beneath her composed exterior, a fragility in her tone that tugged at Marcus's heartstrings like a violin, strings stretched too tight. Sebastian finally spoke, his voice equally refined, but carrying undertones of genuine gratitude. "We don't wish to be any trouble, sir. We simply need a safe place to wait until morning, somewhere we can rest without fear." The way they spoke about their parents being indisposed sent up red flags in Marcus's mind. Were they runaways from some wealthy family? Had they fled from domestic violence, hidden behind closed doors and expensive facades? The rich, Marcus had learned from years of fixing their luxury cars, often had the most twisted problems, their money buying privacy for their darkest secrets. Despite his wariness and every instinct screaming that this situation was far from normal, he couldn't bring himself to turn away two young people in a storm, regardless of their mysterious circumstances or their unusual manner of speaking. "Come inside, both of you," Marcus said, stepping back from the door and ignoring the voice in his head that warned him this was probably a mistake of epic proportions. His mother had always told him that his heart was too big for his own good, and Sarah had often laughed about his inability to turn away strays, whether they were animals or people. The twins entered his humble trailer with the same grace they'd displayed outside, moving like dancers across a stage, taking in their surroundings without any visible judgment or disgust, despite the obvious contrast between their world and his. Danny watched them with unbridled fascination, probably because he'd never seen young adults quite like these before. Marcus certainly hadn't either in his 32 years of life. Their clothes were expensive but understated, the kind of quality that whispered wealth rather than shouting it from rooftops, and they moved with an almost ethereal grace that made them seem older than their 24 years, while simultaneously appearing timeless. Sophia's eyes lingered on a family photo showing Marcus with Danny and his late wife, Sarah, taken during their last Christmas together, when she was already thin from the cancer, but still radiant with love for her family. For just a moment, the young woman's composed facade seemed to crack slightly, revealing something that looked like longing or perhaps recognition of genuine happiness. Sebastian noticed a stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter, utility notices and medical debt that Marcus had tried to hide from Danny. But his expression remained neutral, almost protective, as if he understood the weight of financial burden and chose not to add judgment to it. As they stood dripping slightly on his worn linoleum, floor that had been there since the trailer was new 20 years ago, Marcus realized he was about to make a decision that would change everything, though he had no way of knowing just how dramatically his life was about to transform. Marcus grabbed 2 towels from the bathroom, noting how the twins accepted them with quiet gratitude, but seemed almost surprised by the gesture, as if kindness from strangers was a foreign concept in their carefully controlled world. "You can sleep on the couch tonight," he told them, pulling out some of Danny's old clothes that might fit. Though he doubted these elegant, young people had ever worn anything that hadn't been tailored specifically for them. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry, which is more than you'll find in the garage." Sophia smiled, the first genuinely youthful expression he'd seen from her, and said, "You're very kind, Mr." Her voice carried a note of wonder, as if she was discovering something precious and unexpected. "Rodriguez, Marcus Rodriguez. And this is my son Danny." Sebastian stepped forward then, offering a formal handshake that seemed both adult and endearing. His grip firm but not aggressive, trained and practiced like everything else about him. "We're deeply grateful for your generosity, Mr. Rodriguez. I assure you will be no trouble whatsoever." The way he spoke reminded Marcus of old movies, where children were taught to be seen and not heard, where manners were drilled into them from birth until they became second nature. Armor against a world that judged first and understood later. Danny, meanwhile, was practically vibrating with excitement at having house guests, especially ones who seemed so different from anyone he'd ever met. Even if they were nothing like the neighborhood kids, he usually played with who spoke in slang and moved with the casual roughness of children, raised without pretense. As the twins settled onto his threadbare couch that had been Sarah's favorite reading spot, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary encounter, that forces beyond his understanding were at work in his small world. While he prepared makeshift bedding from clean sheets that smelled of the cheap detergent he bought in bulk, he observed them more closely, studying their behavior like a mechanic diagnosing an unusual engine problem. Their posture remained perfect, even in relaxation, spine straight and shoulders back, as if they were constantly being watched and evaluated by some invisible authority. They spoke to each other in hushed tones, their conversation flowing in what sounded like a different language entirely, melodic and complex with sounds that seemed to dance on the air rather than simply conveying meaning. When he brought them glasses of water, they accepted them with ceremony, holding the mismatched dollar store cups as if they were receiving fine crystal from a royal butler, their gratitude so profound it seemed almost religious in nature. Sophia noticed Danny hovering nearby, clearly wanting to join their conversation, but too shy to insert himself into their sophisticated world. She patted the space beside her with a warm smile that transformed her entire face. "Would you like to sit with us, Danny? We'd enjoy the company immensely." Her invitation broke through Danny's shyness like sunlight through storm clouds, and soon all three were chatting quietly, while Marcus tried to process the surreal nature of his evening, wondering if he'd fallen asleep over the broken dishwasher and was dreaming this entire encounter. The twins seemed genuinely interested in Danny's stories about school and his friends, asking thoughtful questions about his teachers, his favorite subjects, and the playground politics that dominated third-grade social life. They listened with an attention that few adults gave his son, their focus complete and unwavering, as if Danny's 8-year-old perspective on the world was the most fascinating thing they'd ever encountered. Something about their presence brought a lightness to the trailer that had been absent since Sarah's death 2 years ago, filling the space with laughter and warmth that Marcus had almost forgotten was possible within these thin walls that had witnessed so much grief. The way Sophia encouraged Danny to tell his stories, the way Sebastian asked follow-up questions that showed he was truly listening, created an atmosphere of genuine interest and connection that made Marcus's heart ache with both gratitude and loss. "Are you too hungry?" Marcus asked, realizing he hadn't offered them anything to eat since they'd arrived, his mother's voice echoing in his memory about the importance of feeding guests, no matter how little you had to offer. The twins exchanged another one of their meaningful looks, an entire conversation passing between them in the space of a heartbeat, before Sophia answered with careful consideration. "We would appreciate something small if it's not too much trouble. We don't wish to impose upon your resources." Marcus rummaged through his sparse pantry, mentally cataloguing the meager contents that reflected his financial reality more clearly than any bank statement. Eventually, he settled on peanut butter sandwiches, hardly fancy fare for people who were obviously accustomed to better. Probably much better, but it was wholesome and filling, the kind of simple food that had sustained him and Danny through their darkest days. When he presented the simple meal, however, both twins thanked him as if he'd prepared a 7-course meal at a 5-star restaurant, their gratitude so genuine and effusive that Marcus felt embarrassed by their praise. Sebastian took a careful bite, his eyes widening slightly as flavors, apparently foreign to his palate, registered on his consciousness, as if he'd never tasted peanut butter before in his entire life. "This is quite delicious," he said with what seemed like genuine surprise, and Marcus found himself wondering what kind of sheltered, rarefied existence these young people had lived, that a basic peanut butter sandwich could provoke such wonder. Danny giggled at Sebastian's formal way of complimenting such a basic meal, but there was no mockery in his laughter, just the pure joy of sharing something familiar and beloved with new friends who appreciated it in ways that elevated the ordinary into something special. As the evening progressed and the storm continued its assault on the trailer park, Marcus found himself drawn into conversations with the twins that felt both natural and surreal, like speaking with old friends who happened to come from an entirely different dimension of existence. They asked thoughtful questions about his work as a mechanic, showing genuine curiosity about the intricacies of engine repair and the satisfaction he found in fixing things that others had given up for dead. They inquired about Danny's interests with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for important business meetings, treating his son's passion for dinosaurs and superhero comics as subjects worthy of serious, scholarly discussion. They wanted to know about the trailer park community, about the neighbors who had become like family over the years, about the informal support networks that kept everyone afloat when times got tough, all while maintaining their peculiar formality that made every conversation feel like a diplomatic summit. Sophia seemed particularly fascinated by the family photos scattered around the small living room, studying each one with an intensity that went far beyond polite interest, as if she was trying to decode some mysterious formula for happiness that had always eluded her understanding. When she asked about Sarah, Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied memories of his late wife, but somehow found himself sharing stories he rarely discussed with anyone. Tales of their courtship, their dreams, their struggles, and their love that had sustained them through everything life had thrown at them. She was a teacher, he told them, his voice growing soft with remembrance. 3rd grade, just like Danny is now. She would have loved meeting you two, would have been fascinated by your stories and your backgrounds. She always said children were the most honest judges of character, that they could see through pretense and artifice to the truth underneath. Sebastian nodded solemnly, as if he understood the weight of loss in a way that seemed impossible for someone his age, his green eyes reflecting depths of experience that suggested he had witnessed more sorrow than most people twice his years. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman," he said quietly, "the kind of person who leaves the world better than she found it." Their presence was having an odd effect on Marcus. For the first time in months, the trailer felt like a home rather than just a place where he and Danny survived from day to day, struggling to keep their heads above water in an ocean of bills and responsibilities and grief. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on everything from Danny's favorite books to Marcus's dreams of someday opening his own garage, dreams that had been put on hold indefinitely. When Sarah got sick and the medical bills began their relentless accumulation. Around 10:30, Marcus decided it was time for everyone to get some sleep, though he was genuinely reluctant to end this strange and wonderful evening that had brought more warmth and connection into his life than he'd experienced since Sarah's passing. As he tucked Danny into bed, performing the nightly ritual that had become sacred in their small family, his son whispered with the conspiratorial tone reserved for sharing important secrets, "Dad, do you think they're really just regular people?" Marcus paused in his tucking, because he'd been wondering the exact same thing all evening, the question nagging at him like a persistent itch he couldn't quite reach. "What do you mean, buddy?" he asked, though he suspected he knew exactly what his perceptive son was getting at. Danny's voice dropped even lower, barely audible above the rain that continued its steady percussion against their roof. "They talk like people in those old movies Mom used to watch, all fancy and formal. And did you see how they looked at our pictures? Like they'd never seen a real family before, like they were studying us or something." Out of the mouths of babes, Marcus thought, realizing his 8-year-old had picked up on the same subtle oddities that had been nagging at him throughout the evening. Sometimes people are just different. Danny, different backgrounds, different upbringings, different experiences. But different doesn't mean bad, and it doesn't mean we should treat them any differently. As he kissed his son goodnight, breathing in the familiar scent of childhood that clung to Danny's hair, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what morning would bring. Whether these mysterious young people would simply vanish as suddenly as they'd appeared, leaving him to question whether this entire encounter had been real or just another stress-induced hallucination brought on by too little sleep and too much worry. The twins were settling onto the couch when Marcus returned to the living room, their earlier composed confidence replaced by something that looked almost vulnerable, more human and accessible than they'd appeared since arriving at his door. In the soft lamplight that cast gentle shadows around his humble home, they looked more like the young people they actually were, tired, slightly lost, and genuinely grateful for the simple kindness of a warm, dry place to spend the night. "Mr. Rodriguez," Sophia said quietly, her voice carrying a weight of emotion that suggested her words were more than mere politeness. "We want you to know that your hospitality means more to us than we can properly express. We haven't experienced generosity quite like this in, well, perhaps ever." Sebastian nodded in agreement, adding with the same emotional undertone, "We've traveled extensively, stayed in the finest accommodations money can purchase, but we've never felt as welcome anywhere as we do here in your home." Their words carried implications that made Marcus uncomfortable, suggesting they'd seen more of the world than most people their age, yet somehow less of genuine human kindness, as if their wealth had insulated them from the very connections that made life meaningful. Marcus felt his protective instincts kick in, the same paternal feelings he harbored for Danny, extending naturally to these two mysterious houseguests, who seemed to need protection from something he couldn't identify. "Everyone deserves a safe place to sleep," he told them simply, the words coming from a philosophy of life that Sarah had helped him develop during their years together. "And you're welcome here as long as you need to stay. Nobody should have to face a storm alone." As he turned off the lights and headed toward his own room, Marcus had no idea that his simple act of kindness was about to set in motion events that would change all their lives forever, creating ripples that would spread far beyond the walls of his modest trailer. Marcus lay awake for a long time that night, staring at the water-stained ceiling that he'd been meaning to repair for months, listening to the rain slowly fade from a driving downpour to a gentle patter that created a soothing rhythm against the metal roof. Through the thin walls that provided little privacy in their cramped living quarters, he could hear the twins whispering to each other in their strange language, their voices carrying a musical quality that seemed to echo in his dreams. When he finally drifted off into fitful sleep, he woke several times throughout the night, his parental instincts compelling him to check on his unexpected guests, finding them sleeping peacefully on his old couch, with Sebastian's arm protectively draped over his sister in a gesture that spoke of long practice and deep connection. There was something almost otherworldly about how they slept, too still, too peaceful, as if they were posing for a Renaissance painting rather than simply resting after a long and difficult day. In his half-awake state, caught between consciousness and dreams, Marcus could have sworn their blonde hair seemed to shimmer slightly in the darkness, catching and reflecting the streetlight that filtered through his curtains in ways that defied normal physics. But he dismissed these observations as tricks of exhaustion and stress. By morning, he'd convinced himself that his overtaxed mind and the emotional weight of barely making ends meet were making him imagine things that weren't there, creating mysteries where only kindness and coincidence existed. Dawn broke grey and overcast, the storm having passed but leaving behind the fresh, clean smell that always followed heavy rain, along with the inevitable puddles and mud that would make navigating the trailer park's unpaved roads treacherous for days to come. Marcus woke to sounds that didn't belong in his morning. Routine, voices, in his kitchen that were too numerous and too cheerful for his usual reality. Not unusual since Danny was naturally an early riser who often woke with the enthusiasm of someone who viewed each new day as an adventure. But there were definitely more voices than there should have been, and they carried that same musical quality he'd noticed the night before. He padded out to his small kitchen in his worn slippers and faded bathrobe, expecting to find Danny chatting with their guests over whatever meager breakfast he'd managed to scrounge from their nearly empty refrigerator, but instead discovered something that stopped him in his tracks and made him question his grip on reality. All three of them were sitting around his small, scratched table that had seen better days before Danny was born, sharing a breakfast spread that definitely hadn't come from his nearly empty refrigerator or his pathetically sparse pantry. Fresh fruit that looked like it had been picked that morning gleamed in perfect arrangements, strawberries that were impossibly red and sweet-smelling, oranges with skin so bright they seemed to glow from within, grapes that hung in perfect clusters, like something from a classical still-life painting, pastries that looked like they'd come from the most expensive bakery in the city, golden and flaky and dusted with powdered sugar, sat alongside what appeared to be freshly squeezed orange juice in a pitcher that definitely didn't belong to him. The entire spread probably cost more than he typically spent on groceries in 2 weeks, maybe 3 if he was being particularly careful with his budget, yet somehow it had materialized in his kitchen overnight, without any explanation. Where did all this come from? Marcus asked, rubbing his eyes and wondering if he was still dreaming. If stress had finally pushed him into some kind of elaborate hallucination that felt more real than reality itself. Sophia looked up with that same enigmatic smile she'd worn the night before, the expression of someone who was accustomed to having questions she preferred not to answer directly. We wanted to thank you for your kindness, so we prepared breakfast. We hope you don't mind that we took some liberties with your kitchen. I need you to be honest with me, Marcus said, settling into the remaining chair with the careful movements of someone who was trying to make sense of an impossible situation. And, I mean, completely honest. Where exactly did you get all this food? My refrigerator was practically empty last night, and I would have heard you moving around, going in and out. The twins exchanged their familiar, meaningful glance, that wordless communication that seemed to convey entire conversations in the space of a heartbeat. And Marcus could practically see them having an internal debate about how much truth they were willing to reveal. Sebastian cleared his throat with the delicate precision of someone who had been trained in the art of diplomatic conversation. Mr. Rodriguez, we realize our situation must seem highly unusual to you. We're not quite ordinary people.